Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Realm of History live review tonight for chapter 20. Hey, make sure you're checking out in the comments. Let me know that you're here. Let me know that you're in the session. I appreciate you being here. It means that you care about your grade and the class. And of course, we're here to put in some work to get a little bit of a last minute review, make sure that we're ready for tomorrow. Let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do tonight. Pretty standard format. We are going to have a little bit of an introduction here about what we're going to do. We'll have some important advice as usual. I think the most important things to talk about. Then we'll go over some selected key figures and terms. I've got about 10 to 12. Shouldn't take us too long. We'll have some AP advice and, of course, the question and answer time that you can get all of your questions answered for tomorrow's quiz tonight. Let's go over the important advice. Hey, I think it's really important to write things down from this session. Seems like most of the students that pay attention during this session and write information down are the ones that are doing really well in the quiz papers. Number two, like I said today in class, it's most important that you read through your outline notes. Those are your number one study guide tool to get ready for quizzes. And then, of course, use the review sheet to quiz yourself. That's why I have you do it on a separate sheet so that you can quiz yourself off of that review sheet. That's really the standard practice of the realm. Number two, we always got to remember to pray for the right things, right? There's so many things going on in the world. You have so many stresses and so many worries outside of this quiz tomorrow that are way more important. So make sure that when you're praying for your health and your safety, the health of your family. And, I think saying the prayer of gratitude for all the blessings that we have and how fortunate all of us really are to be where we're at, worrying about a quiz instead of worrying about things that are life and death situations, right? So you got to imagine, all of those people out there that are struggling every day, trying to find their next meal. So if you think about that, you're in a really good spot to be here tonight and to be taking a quiz tomorrow. So I think it's valid to ask the good Lord for guidance, though. Ask the good Lord to bless you, to help you get ready for this quiz and to give your best possible effort and to use all the talents that you've been blessed with. I really think that is a good way to go. Next is going to be the third point on the list, and that's to be here now. Mental focus in some of the classes has been good this week. Other classes, not so great. Stuff going around in the hallway, this and that. I think we got to get that focus tonight for the remainder. And then, of course, the focus period tomorrow, getting yourself ready for not only the assessment or quiz in my class, but I think you got some other quiz papers in your other classes. So making sure that you're being here now. Be here now doesn't just apply to the realm. It applies to every aspect of life. And if you can apply it to every aspect of life, then you will be a champion in my book. Next, number 4, I think it's really important to say thank you to your parents. As a parent, I understand the sacrifices that parents make for you. And I think you should make sure that you are grateful and express your gratitude to them. If you have to leave the session right now to go tell them, go do it. If you do it after, that's fine. But make sure sometime tonight before you go to bed, make sure you say thank you to your parents or your loved ones. Finally, listen, guys and gals, please meet the challenge tomorrow. It's going to be a challenge. I'm looking to challenge you in all ways possible. So I'm not trying to take it easy on you. The questions are going to be challenging. There's going to be some easy ones and some hard ones, some in the middle, but it should be a challenge. It really should be a challenge if we want to grow academically, mentally. I think that's really important. So give your best effort, but don't shy away. Don't skip school. I'm really against that. Don't, because you got a quiz or 2 or 3 quizzes, you're going to say, oh, I'm not going to go tell your parents that you don't feel good and try to trick them. Don't do that. That's a sign of weakness in my book. I mean, you got to be there, making sure that you're meeting the challenge, that you're rising to the occasion, and putting in the work now when you're in high school. It's very important to develop those very good habits that you can take with you, not only into college, but into the workforce when you have a job and you have a family to take care of. You won't be able to say, I'm not going to take care of my family. I'm not going to take care of my baby. You won't be able to do that. So when you have a quiz or a test, don't do that now. That's a bad habit to practice. Okay. That being said, I think we're going to get into the key terms and figures. I'm pretty fired up. Don't forget, right after this session, give me about 5 minutes. We're going to have the extra credit opportunity tonight with the video game. Okay, so we'll see how that works out. It's a new thing that we're trying. It's kind of fun for me, but we'll see how it goes for the extra credit. High chance, 50% chance of getting an extra credit point there. Key terms and figures. Let's start with joint stock companies. Hey, joint stock companies, they worked very much like modern day corporations where investors would buy shares of stock in a company. Now, the early ones were about colonization. Most of these early joint stock companies were having people invest in overseas exploration and funding colonies through expeditions. And we kind of did a scenario in class where we had a student that was going to be a captain. They couldn't afford all their ships. So they had to get investors to give them a percentage of the total cost. Well, what those investors invested, let's say they invested 20%, 15%, 10%, whatever profits the expedition made, you got that cut of the profit. So if you put in 20%, you got 20% of the overall profit. So that's a joint stock company, very much like how it's very similar to, in a way, shape, or form, how the stock market works today. All right, next we're going to talk about, this was a big picture question today. A lot of people had questions about this one. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight what I think is most important to know here. This is the African version of slavery or Muslim version of slavery in Africa versus the American system of slavery. Listen, the main difference is the harsh nature or the harsh treatment in the American system. The American system was much more harsh, much more racially superiority motivated. Slavery in the Americas was something that was hereditary. So if you were a slave, your children were automatically going to be slaves. That's what hereditary means. In the American system, there was no social mobility. You could not move up or down in the social class system. You were stuck in a state of slavery for your life. In the African/Muslim version of slavery, now please understand, the Muslims enslaved more African peoples than any other group, okay, for a longer period of time. And then within Africa, there was slavery, tribal slavery, tribe versus tribe, which didn't see eye to eye. They didn't see each other as connected. They were all like individual countries. They were wars, right? So they had slavery too. The difference is in the African and Muslim slavery, there was a chance that you could earn your freedom. It was a much higher propensity that you could earn freedom in those systems. There was some social mobility. Okay, so you could move out of slavery into a free person or into a lower class citizen. And then also it was not hereditary. So just because you were a slave, if you had children, it didn't necessarily mean that they were going to be a slave. So that's what you really want to be able to explain. Could that be a short answer? It could be, right? Because there's a lot to explain there. But understanding the differences, that's what we're really looking at. A lot of questions about that one today, but hopefully that should square it up. Okay, next is the encomienda system, right? And if you're just joining in, I see some people popping in. Make sure you let me know in the comments that you're here. It's really important to let me know. I would say if you can't comment for some reason, have a friend. Let me know that you're here so that I can get a tally and get some statistical data on who's showing up, who's not. Looks like our numbers are down. When we had chapter 1, chapter 2, we had over 100 people on here. We kind of dwindled down. I don't know why that is, but we'll see how it goes. The encomienda system, very important term from section 1 in the printed notes. The encomienda system is a forced labor system that was implemented by the Spanish. Okay. Basically what they did is they put Native Americans to work as slaves, basically, in mines and fields. It provided a very cheap labor source for colonization. Next is the key term that we learned about in section 4, our most recent section of study, which is called mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic theory. It means it's a theory, not really a law, okay? So it's an ideology that a country's power depends mainly on its wealth. Countries would try to get as much gold as possible by selling more goods than they were buying from other countries, which is known as a favorable balance of trade. What these countries wanted to have is they wanted to export more than they were importing, which gave them a favorable balance of trade. Next is the term inflation. Now, inflation is a term that we've learned about throughout the year at different intervals. But in this chapter, let's talk about it again. It's basically a decrease in the value of money, coupled or paired with an increase in the price of goods. The reason that it's important in this chapter is because Spain experienced a great amount of inflation due to the boatloads of gold and silver coming into Spain from the Americas. There was so much gold and silver coming into Spain that it caused inflation, because gold and silver were the coins and the currency system in Spain and in most places in the world at this time. So when you have an influx of that, it makes the money less rare, and money is only valuable because it is rare, right? Just like diamonds are only valuable because they're rare. If you're a young lady, you want diamonds. Why? Because they're expensive, they're beautiful, they're shiny, they're rare. If you're a guy, you're going to have to eventually maybe buy one of those, depending on what you do with your life or what your viewpoints are. But you have to maybe get an engagement ring. The only reason they're so expensive is because they are rare. If you could find diamonds and dig them up in your backyard, would some young lady really want one, right? So you got to think about it as far as the price of goods. The value of money is based on its scarcity, really, and the fact that it is not very common. Okay, I do have Vasco da Gama on the list. Vasco da Gama is mostly a chapter 19 figure, but he was a Portuguese explorer that sailed a direct route to India by going under the southern tip of Africa. So south around the southern tip of Africa, all the way to India. And this is the reason why all the European countries like Spain, England, the Dutch were trying to find an alternative route, is because Vasco da Gama did this first for the Portuguese. So they kind of had control and mastery over that major trade route. All the other explorers were trying to find a passageway by traveling west, like Christopher Columbus. Problem is, unless you sail all the way down around the tip of Southern America, there's no way through, right? Not until the creation of the Panama Canal, which comes into play much later. But nonetheless, Vasco da Gama kind of started this major competition for trade routes and expansion, which led to the foundation of the Americas for Europe. Next is Ferdinand Magellan. Ferdinand Magellan and his crew were the first to circumnavigate the globe. Remember, he was killed in the Philippines during a local war. But this first trip around the entire world lasted from 1519 to 1522. Next, as we go through our list, we're going to talk about a key Native American figure. His name was Metacom. The English called him King Philip because he looked like the King of Spain at the time. The King of Spain was Philip II. And so they thought that Metacom looked like Philip of Spain. And so they called him that. But he led a revolt against the British along the East Coast near Massachusetts in 1675. And that was pretty successful for about 7 to 8 months. And then toward the end of that, he eventually was killed, and they put his head on a spear and they paraded around Massachusetts. So people would see not that they meant business. Hey, don't rebel against the English. That was kind of the goal of that. That happened quite often. Next, a lot of questions today came about global trade, right? Global trade, really simple to explain. It's just kind of trade that began to expand worldwide, with the shipment of goods now traveling across oceans and waterways from continent to continent. Trade used to be by land, usually by local expansions. But now that we've got people being able to get from Europe to the Americas and from Europe to Asia, it opens up a great deal of shipment of items that you might not have been able to have access to before. I just want to make a reference point here before we move on into our AP advice. There really were 3 terms that are more chapter 19. That's Treaty of Tordesillas, Line of Demarcation, and Vasco da Gama. So don't be confused. They were taught in chapter 19. You can reference your notes or the book. They're just really very relevant and heavily linked to the occurrences of chapter 20. So that's why I put them on the review sheet. There may or may not be direct questions about them. Either way, you need to know that information. Okay, let's see. The short answer. I'm going to give you some clues on the short answer. There were 6 options there. If I were you, I would focus on the Atlantic or triangular trade system, the diagram that we had on the board. I left it on the board today if you didn't see it. And then, of course, the Columbian Exchange, the items that were traded or introduced from Americas to the world, and then items that were from the world introduced for the first time into the Americas. That's a really important chart. I think it's on page 572, right? We want to make sure that we have a good understanding of those ideologies. Okay, I have a little bit of AP advice for you. Okay, a couple of things. Some of the earlier classes, I made a mistake. I said there were going to be only 8 AP questions. I made a mistake. There's 12 AP questions. 8 of them are MCQs, and then there's 4 comprehension questions. I'm still fronting you 6 points, so the low that you can get is 6. I'm going to make everything like a quarter or a half a point each. Probably one or the other. You know what I'm saying? One, if it's MCQs, it'll probably be either half a point or a quarter of a point. And then if it's the comprehension, it might be a half a point or a quarter of a point. I'll make, it doesn't really matter. I'll let you know on the quiz tomorrow. Okay, so AP advice. First piece of AP advice. You got to understand why natives are so susceptible to disease. See, what you need to understand is that in the Americas, there really were there was really a lack of domesticable species. The Americas did not have the horse, the pig, the goat, the lamb. Really, the only domesticable species that the Americas had were the dog, okay, and turkey. So most of your early diseases came from domesticable species. Smallpox, chickenpox, measles, all of those different diseases come from animals and proximity to animals. Europeans had the bubonic plague, had smallpox, had different types of fevers. So they had gone through that. Many people died. 1/3 of the population died in Europe, even more in some places, right? So they had developed antibodies, they had developed immunities. By the time they came to the Americas, the natives had never had those experiences. So they were very susceptible to these type of diseases, and it killed 95% of the population. But you're going to need to understand historically why they got diseases and why natives didn't give any diseases to the Europeans. That is why it's all due to domesticable species and lack thereof. Okay. Next, number 2, what factors led to an increase in the Atlantic slave trade? One thing you really need to understand here is that Europeans first enslaved Native Americans. They definitely enslaved Native Americans first, and natives died off due to disease. But there's one other thing that I think in AMSCO it kind of hit at. Native peoples had gender roles, and in the native societies, women generally did the farming and men still did the hunting. We're still talking about mostly hunting and gathering societies with a little bit of farming. So if you're a man and the Europeans come in and make you a slave and then make you work on a field in a farm, this is like putting you in a feminine role. And so a lot of native males, they refused to work. They were beaten, they were whipped, they were killed because they would sit down on the ground. They would not do what they saw as women's work in the gender roles. And so this led to a problem where they were being killed. They were, feeling bad about themselves. So they went into depression. And then a lot of more people were dying due to disease. So when the natives die off or refuse to work and get killed or whipped or enslaved and put in different works like mines, European countries then turned to Africa to bring slaves from Africa into the Americas. Now, people in Africa did have access to domesticable species, so they were also immune to the diseases. So Europeans kind of said, oh, well, here's a better labor force than the natives. And that's really what starts the Atlantic slave trade. So understanding that, I think, is a really big picture thing as well. This one's pretty basic. Spanish seeking gold and silver. What did that lead to? Well, great power for Spain. They became the most powerful country in the world, but eventually did lead to inflation. Okay. So that kind of brought them back down. So Spain went really, really high up there as far as power in the world in the 1500s. But then by the 1600s, because of inflation, they were on the downfall. That's something you need to know as well. The comprehension questions, okay, those are going to be from topics 4.2 to 4.5. That was the assigned reading. Those are all going to be based off of bold key terms from the reading, all based off of the bold key terms of the reading. So what I'm basically saying to you is if you did the reading and you understand those key terms in the AMSCO, the comprehension questions you should be able to answer. And then I promised my classes, I said, well, most of them, I said that I would tell you if it's going to be multiple choice or short answer. I took the quiz myself here just a moment ago, and I decided to make those multiple choice questions just to make sure that we could get our quiz in the 45 minutes that we have tomorrow. So that is where we are at with the AP advice. Hopefully that's helpful to you. Now I'm going to turn to the comments and we're going to go into the question and answer session. Oh boy, we got more false identities. Jeez. All right, looks like Sir Ducky is back. No, it's just really Gia is on here. Okay. All right, thanks for checking in. I see everybody there. I would like to get into any tennis is a banned word in the realm. We don't say tennis. Sorry. All right, I'm looking for real questions here. So, oh, somebody's answering about the Treaty of Tordesillas. Excellent. What should we know about Here's a real question. All right, what should we know about Montezuma? Montezuma was the Aztec emperor at the time of the Spanish conquest. So you really need to know that he's the person that thought that Cortez and his advisors thought that Cortez might have been the returning god Quetzalcoatl. And so he didn't attack Cortez right away, right? And then eventually he's the guy who's in power when they are conquered by the Spanish. All right. Port of Calicut was a major port city in India. Everybody was trying to get to Calicut for the spice trade. And that was the kind of like the aiming point for Columbus's journeys. And then he runs into the Americas, right? So that's what everybody's trying to get to as far as their exploration and their trade routes. And then the Philippines, you want to know that that's where Magellan and his crew stopped on their journey to circumnavigate the globe. And then they got, of course, into a local war trying to get resources so they could continue their trip. And that's where Magellan was shot and killed in one of those local wars. All right, students in the chat or former students, let's keep everything appropriate. Let's not be getting on each other's case. Okay, be nice. Well, there you go. It's going to be multiple choice tomorrow on the quiz. Looks like we got a little crew rowing, bantering back and forth about rowing. Let's keep it world history related here. Henry Hudson. Okay, Henry Hudson is a Dutch explorer. All right, so he was sailing for the Netherlands, and he was looking for the Northwest Passage. He was trying to sail up north through Canada or above north of Canada and try to get to the Pacific Ocean that way, which would have been a very, very quick route to Asia. But the problem is that it's covered by ice, right? So you couldn't get through there. So he did discover like Hudson Bay, Hudson Strait, and made some colonies or some foundings there for, of course, the Dutch. Then they started to participate in the fur trade with the Iroquois tribes and other native tribes there. All right, here we go. What is the difference between Hernan Cortez and Francisco Pizarro? Okay, so they're both Spanish conquistadors. Hernan Cortez conquered the Aztecs in Mexico. Francisco Pizarro conquered the Inca in Peru 10 years later. So Cortez conquers the Aztecs in 1521. Pizarro conquers the Inca shortly after 1530. All right, so let's see. Well, it's on the AP portion. So, though the AP questions are comprehension from the AMSCO, of course. Yeah. Who's Evil Lango? Why would you do that? That's terrible. What kind of shampoo does he use? Anybody ask him that? Reese, I went over Henry Hudson. I said he was a Dutch explorer. He was searching for what's called the Northwest Passageway. He was trying to go up through Canada and made some discoveries there for the Dutch. Okay, interesting question here. Why did the English have so little impact on all of this compared to Portugal, Spain, and France? The English get into the game a little bit later. So, Portugal and Spain had already made inways in the Americas in the 1500s. The English don't really start coming over until 1620, right? 1608, 1607, you've got Jamestown. So they just come into play a little bit later. But once they do come into play, I think they actually take in the Americas, they take over a vast amount of land very fast, right? So I think early on those other countries had a stronghold, and then after the French and Indian War, England came to dominate what is now the United States and Canada as well. Yep, yeah, you're definitely going to have to know, especially in the Caribbean. In the Caribbean, you've got a lot of Spanish strongholds, like Cuba, like the Dominican, but then the ones that we were focused on in this chapter, you've got, of course, for the French, you've got Haiti, you've got Guadeloupe, you've got Martinique. For the English, you have Jamaica and Barbados. And then for the Dutch, you have the Greater and Lesser Antilles, and then also the island of Aruba. Sure, Bella. The line of demarcation is all right. It's a line created, it's an imaginary line created by the Pope. It's basically, if you looked on the map, it's basically 60 degrees west longitude. And basically, the line of demarcation is the big picture part of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Everything west of that line went to Spain. So, like Peru, Mexico, and then just it kind of goes right through modern day Brazil. So, everything east of that line goes to Portugal. Portugal gets Brazil, and then Portugal also gets the western coast of Africa too. So that was the Pope was like, we need to stop the fighting between Spain and Portugal at sea and stop them fighting over these new lands. So he steps in 1493 and he makes this Pope Alexander. He makes this treaty to where they have to stay on this side or that side of newly explored lands. Yeah, Mr. Rozier, that's Bartholomew Diaz. So he's not on the review sheet for this week. Vasco da Gama is the one who went all the way around and then all the way to India, right? That's the guy you want to know for this one. All right, so this one, I already went over the port of Calicut. I went over the Philippines. Brazil was a colony of the Portuguese that became a major sugar cane plantation area that they had slave labor working on. The Bahamas and the Caribbean, obviously those were colonized by all of these different countries. The Bahamas We believe now, based on recent studies, that Christopher Columbus actually landed on an island in the Bahamas. And then, of course, Cuba was a Spanish stronghold during this time. Almost all the major expeditions that went into conquering the Aztec and then went into conquering the Inca, they were based off of Cuba. Cortez lived on the island of Cuba before he took over the Aztec, for example. Well, Riley, here you just really need to know that it was an island that was colonized by the French. It's in the Caribbean, and it was used as a sugar and cotton plantation site for the French. So if you look at the chart, Europeans were using guns and gold to buy African peoples, and then they sent the African peoples to work on plantations in the Americas. So it's basically an exchange of guns and gold for humans. Boji guy, the forms of disease that you really want to know, okay? Influenza, measles, smallpox is the biggest one, typhoid fever. If you know two of those, three of those, and one of them needs to be smallpox, you're probably in good shape. Now, I want to make something clear. Tomorrow, if a short answer says, okay, list 5 items that the world introduced to the Americas, and you write 5 diseases, you're probably not going to get credit. I'll give you credit for 1 or 2 diseases, but you need to kind of diversify those items. I don't want to see 5 diseases because that's not really characteristic of an example of the Columbian Exchange. Sky, there's going to be there's 2 versions, so there'll be 3 or 4. All right, one version has 3, one version has 4. So if there's a question on the 7 key factors, you would need to be able to explain them. I mean, listing it, the question could say list, or it could say list and explain. So it depends on what the question says. But I mean, I would be able to briefly do a sentence about each one. Yeah. Treaty of Tordesillas was that treaty that I said the Pope made. He stepped in because there was a big battle between Spain and Portugal. So he comes in and he creates an imaginary divider line where everything west of that line, which is called the line of demarcation, went to Spain. Everything east of that line went to Portugal. Describe the consequence of Atlantic slave trade. Yeah, you need to think about mostly what are the positive and negative effects, right? It's hard to say positive effects, but a lot of these countries that use slave labor got really wealthy off of it because they didn't have to pay people to work, right? So it really helped their economies. However, it totally ruined families in Africa, right? It totally, you have ownership of people, which is definitely a problem. So the consequences are, most of them are negative the way that we look at it today. But for countries like England and France and Spain, they saw an economic benefit from using the system. So that is a consequence. The consequences are not always negative. Consequences are just things that happen because of something, right? Um, Section 1, Section 2 also went over the islands. It's directly in the notes, though, what you need to know about the islands. That's the chart on page 572. 572. It's directly written on your review sheet too. That's not very nice. What? How do you figure? You're trying to trigger me now. That's not very nice, Gia. We should be nice in the comments. We should be nice in the comments. I think I might have to remove this person from the chat. Okay, well, I haven't seen a real question in the chat for a minute. I'm going to stay on for about one more minute, and then it is going to be time for the extra credit challenge. Yeah, so we are going to get ready for that. I'll maybe give me 5 minutes to kind of put away my computer and get ready for the NCAA football challenge. Okay, yeah, I don't see any real questions there. So, hey, thank you for joining. I really appreciate you. You know, if you're a Realm family member, I just want to say thank you for being here. And I hope that you have a great night and make sure that you study up and get ready for tomorrow's quiz. All right, be here now. Make sure you say your prayers properly and say thank you to your parents. Have a great night. Hey, if you check in at the extra credit opportunity and you put a comment in the chat, you might be able to qualify for a little bonus point.